The light outside the grocery store is the color of old honey. That particular gold that comes only in the last hour before dusk claims the day. I sit in my car with the engine off, hands still gripping the steering wheel, though I've been parked for several minutes now. The vinyl beneath my palms is worn smooth from years of other people's journeys, other people's destinations. Mine fel sudenli uncertain. Rowan's voice echoes in the space between my ribs. The words he spoke 30 minutes ago, still reverberating like the final note of a song that refuses to fade. You're the only one who gets me. Even now, replaying it, I can hear the slight crack in his voice, the way it dipped lower on the word, only, as if he were sharing something he'd never said aloud before. And then, after a pause that seemed to stretch across the entire afternoon, the question that followed. Can you keep it that way? I close my eyes, and I'm back there, leaning against the warm metal of his truck, the scent of pine needles and motor oil thick in the air around us. He'd been looking out across the empty lot where we'd stopped, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his work jacket, shoulders carrying the particular weight they always seemed to bear. When he turned to face me, there was something unguarded in his expression, something I'd glimpsed before, but never so clearly. It was the look of a man who'd been carrying a secret for too long. The grocery store parking lot is nearly empty now. A woman pushes a cart past my windshield, her footsteps echoing against the asphalt. She glances at me briefly through the glass. Just a man sitting alone in a car. Nothing remarkable about that. She has no way of knowing that everything changed 30 minutes ago, that the person I was when I woke up this morning no longer exists. I think about the space Rowan left in my chest when he said those words. It feels like a door opening to somewhere I've never been allowed to enter, somewhere I'm not sure I'm brave enough to go. 4 months now, our friendship has existed in the safe territory of shared coffee and easy conversation, of favors asked and freely given. I've grown comfortable there in that space where I could appreciate the rough kindness of his hands without having to name what that appreciation meant. But comfort, I'm learning, is not the same thing as honesty. The sun drops lower, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Inside the store, fluorescent lights buzz against the gathering dusk. I should go in buy the milk and bread I came for. Return home to grade the stack of essays waiting on my kitchen table. That's what the old version of myself would do. Retreat into routine, into the predictable rhythms of a life carefully constructed to avoid moments like this one. Instead, I sit here and remember the way Rowan's eyes held mine when he asked his question. Can you keep it that way? There is something almost desperate in the asking, as if my answer would determine more than just the trajectory of our friendship, as if he were asking me to be the keeper of some essential part of himself. I'd said yes without hesitation, the word leaving my lips before I'd fully processed what I was agreeing to. But now, in the quiet aftermath, I understand what he was really asking. He wasn't just seeking my discretion or my loyalty. He was asking me to hold something precious and fragile, something he couldn't trust to anyone else. The weight of that responsibility settles over me like a blanket I'm not sure I'm strong enough to carry. Because the truth is, I do get him in ways that surprise even me. I see past the careful walls he's built, past the role of mechanic and father and husband that he wears like armor. I see the man underneath, thoughtful and wounded and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with the conventional measures of beauty. And that terrifies me more than I'm willing to admit. A truck pulls into the lot, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness. For a moment, my heart jumps, thinking it might be Rowan coming to find me, to continue a conversation we'd left hanging in the air like something too delicate to handle roughly. But it's a stranger, someone with their own ordinary errands, their own unremarkable evening ahead of them. I think about going home to my quiet house, to the garden I tend with such careful attention, to the books that have been my companions longer than any person ever has. That life waits for me, unchanged and unchanging, as dependable as sunrise. But something fundamental has shifted today, some tectonic plate in the landscape of my heart has moved, and I'm not sure I can simply return to what came before. The question he asked wasn't just about keeping his secrets. It was about whether I could be trusted with the deepest parts of who he is, the parts he can't show to anyone else in his carefully ordered world. And my answer, yes, spoken without hesitation, was more than agreement. It was a promise, a covenant entered into with eyes wide open, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. I finally start the car, the engine turning over with a familiar rumble. The grocery store can wait. The essays can wait. Everything, it seems, can wait while I try to understand what it means to be the only one who gets him and whether I'm strong enough to keep it that way. As I pull out of the parking lot, Rowan's voice follows me home, echoing in the spaces between heartbeats, settling into my bones like something I'll carry forever. The golden light has faded to silver now, and the evening stretches ahead of me, full of questions I'm not sure I'm ready to answer. I am 38 years old, and my life has been deliberately small. This town where I teach high school English wears its traditions like armor, every street corner and coffee shop heavy with the weight of things that have always been done a certain way. The students call it boring, this place where nothing ever changes, where the biggest scandal in recent memory was when the Methodist Church switched to contemporary worship music. But I found safety in its predictability, comfort in knowing exactly what each day will demand of me. My house sits at the end of Maple Street, a modest rental with white clapboard siding and a front porch that sags slightly on the left side. The landlord keeps promising to fix it, but I've grown fond of its imperfection, the way it mirrors something in myself. Behind the house, I tend a small vegetable garden with the kind of meticulous attention other people reserve for their children. Tomatoes in neat rows, herbs in carefully labeled sections, everything in its proper place. My neighbors think it's charming, this quiet bachelor who grows his own basil and waves politely from behind his fence. They don't know that gardening is how I keep my hands busy when my mind wants to wander in a territory I've trained it to avoid. They don't know that I chose this life, the evening routine of papers to grade, the weekend solitude, the careful distance I maintain from anything that might ask too much of me. I met Rowan Hale almost a year ago when his son Caleb appeared in my third period literature class. It was October, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes everything feel possible, and Caleb slouched into my classroom with the particular brand of teenage skepticism I've learned to recognize. His father followed a week later for parent-teacher conferences, work boots still dusty from the garage, apologizing for running late. Rowan owns a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, the kind of place where men gather to solve the world's problems while changing oil and rotating tires. He has rough hands and a way of looking directly at you when you speak, as if your words matter more than whatever else might be competing for his attention. That first meeting, he asked thoughtful questions about Caleb's progress, listened without interrupting when I explained his son's potential. Most parents nod and make appropriate noises. Rowan absorbed every word. He started showing up with coffee a month later. No particular reason, he said, just happened to be in the neighborhood with an extra cup from the diner down the street. It became a routine neither of us acknowledged. As such, Tuesday mornings before first period, steam rising from paper cups as we stood in the hallway outside my classroom. He would ask about books I was teaching, not because he planned to read them, but because he seemed genuinely curious about what made them worth discussing. I found myself explaining things I never had to put into words before, why certain stories mattered, why literature could change how someone saw the world. Our conversations had a quality I hadn't experienced before, something that felt like mutual discovery. He would tell me about the cars he worked on, the satisfaction of diagnosing a problem no one else could solve, the meditation he found in the mechanical precision of engine repair. I began to understand that his work was as much art as craft, that there was poetry in the way he described the sound a perfectly tuned engine makes. These exchanges were simple on the surface, two adults finding common ground across different worlds. But underneath ran a current I didn't want to examine too closely. There was something in the way he listened, an attention that felt almost hungry, as if he were storing up my words for later consideration. And something in the way I found myself preparing for those Tuesday mornings, choosing my thoughts as carefully as I chose my clothes. I've spent most of my adult life learning to read people, to recognize the signs that someone might want more than I'm prepared to give. It's a survival skill I developed early and practiced religiously. But with Rowan, those instincts seemed to malfunction. He moved through my defenses like water, finding its way through stone, not by force but by patient persistence. He would appear at unexpected moments, dropping off a book he thought I might enjoy, asking if I needed help with a project around the house, inviting me to grab dinner at the diner when Caleb was with his mother for the weekend. Each interaction was innocent enough individually, but together they began to form a pattern I recognized and feared. The pattern of someone becoming important, of barriers being carefully, quietly dismantled. I told myself it was friendship, nothing more. Rowan was married to Naomi, a kind woman who worked at the bank and volunteered at the animal shelter. I'd met her at school events, watched her laugh at Rowan's jokes, seen the easy affection that passed between them. There was no room in that picture for whatever was growing between Rowan and me. No space for the way our conversations lingered longer than necessary. No explanation for why I found myself thinking about him during the quiet hours when I should have been grading papers or planning lessons. But friendship, I was learning, could be dangerous too, especially when it involved a man who looked at you like you held answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask, who spoke your name like it was something precious he was learning to pronounce. A man who made you forget, in the space of a shared laugh or a moment of comfortable silence, all the reasons you'd chosen a small life in the first place. The invitation comes on a Thursday afternoon in late August, when the heat makes everything shimmer and the air conditioning in my classroom struggles against the weight of another sweltering day. Rowan appears in my doorway as I'm packing up my briefcase, work shirt darkened with sweat, a question in his eyes that he seems reluctant to voice. Caleb's birthday is coming up, he tells me, and he's looking for something that might actually mean something instead of the usual electronics or gift cards. Something that shows he's been paying attention to who his son is becoming. The request surprises me, not because it's unusual, but because of the way he asks it, like he's entrusting me with something important. We drive an hour north to a used bookstore he heard about from someone at the garage, a place called Chapter and Verse tucked between a coffee roastery and an antique shop in a town that feels like it exists in a different decade. The building is narrow and deep, books stacked floor to ceiling with a particular smell that comes from thousands of stories living in one place. Rowan follows me through the aisles with the careful attention of someone navigating unfamiliar territory, occasionally pulling a volume from the shelf to examine its cover before sliding it back into place. I find what we're looking for in the poetry section, a first edition of Gary Soto's work that I remember Caleb mentioning during a class discussion about contemporary voices. The book is in good condition, reasonably priced, exactly the kind of thoughtful gift that says I see you, I hear you, your interests matter to me. Rowan holds it carefully while I explain why this particular poet might resonate with his son, why the stories within these pages could open doors Caleb didn't know existed. The drive back should be unremarkable. Two adults returning from a successful errand. Mission accomplished, conversation easy and familiar. But something shifts as we leave the bookstore behind, as the road unspools through fields washed gold in the late summer light. Rowan drives with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his thigh, and begins talking about his own father in a voice I've never heard before. He tells me about a man who worked construction until his body gave out, who came home each evening too tired for conversation, too frustrated with his own limitations to offer much beyond grunted acknowledgments. A man who loved his family in the way that many men of his generation loved, silently, distantly, as if affection were something that might weaken them if expressed too openly. Rowan's voice grows quieter as he describes the promises he made to himself as a young father, the kind of man he swore he would never become. I'm different with Caleb, he says, glancing over at me briefly before returning his attention to the road. I try to be present, to really listen when he talks. But sometimes I wonder if it's enough, if he knows that everything I do is because I want him to feel seen in ways I never did. The vulnerability in his voice catches me off guard. This is not the casual conversation we usually share, not the comfortable exchange of surface thoughts and observations. This feels like confession, like he's offering me access to runes in himself that he keeps locked away from the rest of the world. The truck's cab suddenly feels smaller, more intimate. Outside, the landscape blurs past in shades of amber and green. But inside, the air has taken on a weight that makes every breath feel deliberate. I want to say something meaningful in return, something that matches the trust he's placed in me. But words feel inadequate against the rawness of what he's shared. That's when he looks over at me again, and this time his eyes linger longer than they should while he's driving. There's something unguarded in his expression, something that makes my chest tighten with recognition and fear. "You're the only one who gets me," he says, and the words fall into the space between us like stones dropped into still water. The simple statement carries more weight than it should, more meaning than the situation seems to warrant. I feel it settling into my bones, this idea that I alone possess some essential understanding of who he is beneath the roles he plays for everyone else. The silence that follows stretches across miles of countryside. I'm searching for a response, for something that acknowledges what he's given me without promising more than I could safely offer, when he speaks again. "Can you keep it that way?" The question hangs in the air like something fragile and dangerous. I understand immediately that he's not just asking about discretion or loyalty. He's asking me to be the guardian of this version of himself, the keeper of the parts he can't show to anyone else in his carefully constructed life. He's asking me to hold his secrets, his doubts, his moments of weakness and wonder, and to keep them safe from a world that might not understand. "Yes," I hear myself say, though my voice sounds like it's coming from somewhere far away. The word leaves my lips before I fully understand what I'm agreeing to, before I can calculate the cost of such a promise. But even as I speak it, I know it's true. Whatever he needs me to keep, whatever part of himself he's willing to entrust to my care, I will guard it as carefully as I guard my own hidden truths. Because in this moment, in the golden light of late afternoon, I finally understand what's been building between us all these months. And that understanding terrifies me more than I'm prepared to admit. The week after our trip to the bookstore, something fundamental shifts between us, like a door that has been carefully opened just wide enough to let light through. Rowan begins appearing at my house more frequently, never with any particular agenda, never staying long enough to feel like an imposition. He shows up on Tuesday evenings while I'm grading papers, settling into the corner of my living room sofa with the kind of comfortable ease that suggests he's been doing it for years rather than days. We don't talk about what happened in the truck, about the promise I made, or the weight it carries. Instead, we exist in this new space we've created together, careful not to examine its boundaries too closely. He brings coffee sometimes, or picks up takeout from the Chinese place downtown. Other times he arrives empty-handed and simply sits, content to be present while I work through my stack of student essays. There's something almost meditative about his presence during those early September evenings. He doesn't need constant conversation or entertainment. He's equally comfortable discussing the book I'm teaching. We spend nearly an hour talking about the symbolism in To Kill a Mockingbird, or sitting in companionable silence while I red pen another batch of comma splices. I begin to understand that for him, being in my living room represents a kind of sanctuary, a place where he can simply exist without having to perform any particular version of himself. But I notice things I didn't allow myself to see before. The way his hand lingers on my shoulder when he brings me a fresh cup of coffee, fingers pressing just slightly into the fabric of my shirt before he pulls away. How our conversations dip deeper into confession now, past the surface of daily concerns into the places where we keep our real thoughts. The way he watches me when he thinks I'm not paying attention, studying my face with the kind of focus he usually reserves for engine diagnostics. One evening in mid-September, I'm wrestling with a stubborn lesson plan when he offers to fix the squeaky hinge on my back door. It's been bothering me for weeks, that high-pitched protest every time I step out to check on the garden. But I've been putting off the repair with the particular inertia that comes from living alone. He disappears into my kitchen and returns with the toolbox I keep under the sink, the one that mostly holds things I never use. The kitchen is narrow, designed for one person's solitary meals and quiet morning coffee. With both of us in it, the space becomes intimate in a way that makes me hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. I try to stay out of his way while he works, but the geography of the room makes that impossible. When he needs to reach for something behind me, his chest brushes against my back. When I move to get him a glass of water, our shoulders touch, and I feel that contact for hours afterward like a brand. He smells like motor oil and the particular soap mechanics used to scrub the work from their hands. But underneath that is something warmer, more essentially him. I find myself memorizing these details without permission, storing up the texture of his voice when he asks for a screwdriver, the way his shoulders move beneath his work shirt as he adjusts the hinge pin. This is dangerous territory, and I know it. But I also can't seem to step away from it, can't seem to create the distance that wisdom would dictate. Because there's something addictive about being needed in this particular way, about being the person he chooses to share his quiet evening hours with, about being trusted with a version of himself that he doesn't show to anyone else. He finishes with the hinge and tests it several times, opening and closing the door until it swings silent and smooth. "There," he says, satisfaction evident in his voice. "That should solve your problem." But when he turns to face me in an aerospace, we're standing closer than we should be, close enough that I can see the flecks of green in his brown eyes, close enough that I have to concentrate on keeping my breathing steady. For a moment, neither of us moves. The kitchen feels smaller than it should, the air charged with something I don't want to name. Then he steps back, creating distance that feels both necessary and disappointing, and begins putting the tools away with the same methodical attention he gave to the repair. After he leaves that night, I stand in my kitchen running my hand over the door frame where he worked, trying to understand what's happening to me. The rational part of my mind catalogs all the reasons this is impossible. He's married. He lives in a town where certain truths can't be spoken. He trusts me in ways that would be destroyed if he knew what I was beginning to feel. But the other part, the part I've spent years learning to ignore, whispers that maybe impossibility isn't the same thing as inevitability. I know I'm crossing lines I promised myself I would never cross. But as I settle into bed that night, I can still feel the ghost of his shoulder against mine, still smell the lingering trace of his presence in my carefully ordered home. And for the first time in years, the thought of being alone feels less like safety and more like a kind of slow starvation. It happens on a February evening when winter has settled over the town like a heavy blanket, muffling sound and slowing time to something that feels suspended, dreamlike. Snow has been falling since mid-afternoon, the kind of steady precipitation that transforms familiar landscapes into something otherworldly. I've built a fire in the living room fireplace, more for the comfort of watching flames dance than for any real need for additional warmth. Rowan arrives just after 7, stamping snow from his boots on the front porch, cheeks flushed from the cold. He's carrying a bag from the hardware store, some small project he wants to tackle while we talk, but the bag gets forgotten almost immediately, set aside, and never mentioned again. The evening unfolds with the same comfortable rhythm we've established over these months. Conversation that flows between the mundane and the meaningful, silences that feel full rather than empty. We talk about Caleb's progress in school, about the book I gave Rowan for his birthday the week before, about the way snow changes the character of a place, making everything feel quieter and more intimate. He tells me about a car he's been working on, a 1967 Mustang that someone brought in more hope than expectation, and how satisfying it is to bring something broken back to life. I share my frustration with a new curriculum mandate that seems designed by people who have never actually stood in front of a classroom. The fire burns lower as the evening progresses, casting shifting shadows across the room. Outside, the snow continues to fall, accumulating on the window ledges in soft, curved drifts. The world beyond my living room feels distant and irrelevant, as if this small pocket of warmth and conversation exists outside the normal flow of time. It's sometime after 9 when our conversation gradually gives way to comfortable silence. I'm reading a book I've been meaning to finish, occasionally glancing up to watch the fire or to catch glimpses of snow falling past the window. Rowan has settled into the armchair across from me, the one that seems to have become his by unspoken agreement, and at some point I realize his breathing has changed, deepened into the rhythm of sleep. I look up from my book to find him completely at rest, head tilted back against the chair, one hand resting on his chest. The lines of worry that he usually carries have smoothed away, leaving his face looking younger, more peaceful than I've ever seen it. The firelight plays across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the curve of his mouth, the way his eyelashes cast tiny shadows on his cheeks. For a long time, I simply watch him sleep, memorizing details I have no right to notice. The steady rise and fall of his chest beneath his flannel shirt. The way his work-roughened hands look almost gentle in repose. The slight part of his lips that suggests he's dreaming of something pleasant. There's an intimacy in witnessing someone's unguarded sleep that feels both precious and dangerous, like being entrusted with something too valuable to possess. And that's when it happens, not as a sudden shock or dramatic revelation, but as something that feels like it's been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. The truth arrives quietly, settling into my consciousness with the weight of inevitability. I am in love with Rowan Hale. Not the careful appreciation I've been allowing myself to feel. Not the safe admiration for his character and kindness that I've been using to explain my behavior. But love in its most complete and terrifying form. The kind that rewrites the fundamental architecture of who you thought you were. I love the way he listens when I talk about books, as if literature were a language he's learning to speak fluently. I love his rough hands and the stories they tell about a life lived through work and purpose. I love the unpolished honesty of his words, the way he never says anything he doesn't mean. I love the tired look he wears like armor, and the rare moments when that armor falls away to reveal something vulnerable and achingly human underneath. I love him for the father he's chosen to be despite the example he was given, for the way he shows up without fanfare when I need help with something around the house, for the comfortable silences and the conversations that matter, for trusting me with the parts of himself he can't show anyone else. The realization should terrify me more than it does, should send me into the kind of panic that comes from recognizing you've wandered into territory from which there may be no safe return. But sitting here in the firelight, watching him sleep in my living room, what I feel instead is a strange kind of peace, as if I've finally stopped fighting something that was always going to win. He's married to Naomi, a woman I've met and liked, who laughs easily and volunteers at the animal shelter and deserves better than to have her husband's heart divided in ways she can't understand. He lives in a world where certain truths can't be spoken, where love like this exists only in shadows and stolen moments. There is no future in this feeling, no path forward that doesn't involve hurt and betrayal and the destruction of carefully built lives. But knowledge and feeling, I'm learning, operate by different rules. And as the fire burns down to embers and the snow continues to fall outside my windows, I sit with this new understanding of myself, this admission that changes everything and nothing all at once. The weeks that follow my revelation pass like pages in a book I'm afraid to read too quickly. March arrives with its usual false promises, warm days followed by cold snaps that remind us winter isn't finished yet. I move through my routines with the careful precision of someone trying not to disturb something fragile, teaching my classes and grading papers, and tending to my garden preparations with the same methodical attention I've always applied to these tasks. But everything feels different now that I've named what lives in my chest. Every Tuesday morning when Rowan appears with coffee, every evening he spends in my living room, every casual touch or shared laugh carries a weight that threatens to overwhelm me. I find myself studying his face when he's not looking, storing up details like someone preparing for a long absence. The way he runs his hand through his hair when he's thinking. The precise way he folds his work clothes before settling into the armchair. The sound he makes, almost a sigh, almost contentment, when he finally relaxes at the end of a long day. I become an expert at managing my own reactions, at keeping my expression neutral when he brushes past me in the kitchen, and maintaining normal conversation when what I really want is to tell him everything and nothing all at once. It's a particular kind of torture, this loving in silence, but it's also strangely sustaining. because at least I know now what this feeling is, can give it its proper name, even if I can never speak it aloud. The confrontation comes on a Thursday evening in late March. I'm at the auto shop, dropping off my car for its annual inspection, a routine errand that I've somehow managed to turn into an excuse to see him during working hours. The garage is nearly empty, most of his employees gone for the day, the overhead lights casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Rowan is finishing up with the last customer, an elderly woman whose ancient sedan he's been keeping running for what seems like decades through sheer mechanical wizardry and genuine concern. After she leaves, we stand in the sudden quiet of the garage, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and the cooling metal sounds of a workday ending. I'm about to make some comment about my car when he speaks first, his voice carrying a weight that makes me look up sharply. "You've been different lately," he says, wiping his hands on a shop rag with more attention than the task requires. "Did I do something?" The question hangs between us in the fluorescent-lit space, and I realize this moment has been building for weeks, maybe months. He's noticed the careful distance I've been trying to maintain, the way I've been editing my responses and measuring my reactions. Of course he's noticed. This is Rowan, who pays attention to everything, who reads people the way he reads engine problems, by listening to the sounds they make when they think no one is paying attention. We're standing near the bay doors, the evening air filtering in through the gap beneath the metal, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Behind him, tools hang in precise rows on pegboard walls, everything in its designated place. The orderliness of it all feels like a rebuke to the chaos I've been carrying inside myself. "No," I tell him, though the word feels inadequate against the complexity of what I'm actually experiencing. "You haven't done anything wrong." But even as I say it, I can see in his eyes that my answer isn't enough, that he's sensing the careful construction of my words. He steps closer, searching my face with the same intense focus he brings to everything that matters to him. "You're the only one I can be honest with," he says, and there's something almost desperate in his voice now. "Please don't change that." The irony of his words is like a knife turning in my chest. Here he is, asking me to preserve the very honesty that I've been systematically destroying through omission and careful silence. He's asking me to remain the person he can trust with his deepest thoughts while I'm drowning in a secret that would fundamentally alter everything between us. I look at his face in the harsh garage lighting and see the vulnerability there, the way he's offering me something precious and fragile. This is what keeping it that way really means, not just protecting his secrets, but protecting him from a knowledge of what those secrets have cost me. It means burying my truth so deep that it can never contaminate the sanctuary we've built together. "I won't," I hear myself say, though the words feel like swallowing glass. "I won't change that." But even as I speak the promise, I can feel something tearing inside me, some essential part of myself being locked away where it can never see daylight. Because this is what love sometimes demands, not confession, not fulfillment, but sacrifice. The sacrifice of carrying a truth that no one else can bear, of being the guardian of someone's peace even when it destroys your own. The relief that crosses his face is immediate and profound, and I understand that my answer has given him something he needed desperately. The assurance that this one relationship in his life will remain uncomplicated, honest, safe. He doesn't know that he's asking me to disappear parts of myself to preserve that safety. He doesn't know that I've already started that disappearance, that I've been practicing the art of loving him in ways he'll never see or understand. But I've made my choice, and as we stand there in the emptying garage with evening falling around us, I accept what that choice means. I will keep it that way, even if it means keeping myself from him forever. Spring arrives that year with an urgency that feels almost apologetic, as if nature is trying to make up for the long winter that held us all captive for too many months. The dogwood trees outside my classroom window burst into bloom seemingly overnight, their white petals catching the light in ways that make everything feel possible again. Students begin to fidget more in their seats, distracted by the promise of summer vacation still months away, and I find myself opening windows to let in air that finally carries warmth instead of bite. Rowan still visits, though something has shifted in the rhythm of these encounters. Our conversations remain easy on the surface, but underneath, I can feel the careful architecture of our new dynamic. The way I've learned to edit my responses, to keep certain thoughts safely locked away, to maintain the distance necessary to preserve what he needs from me. He doesn't seem to notice these adjustments, or if he does, he interprets them as a return to normalcy rather than the systematic burial of half of who I am. The visits become less frequent as spring progresses. Not dramatically so, nothing that would suggest a conscious pulling away, but enough that I begin to count the days between his appearances to measure the growing spaces of silence with something that feels dangerously close to grief. I tell myself this is natural, that the intensity of winter friendships often fade when the world opens up again and people remember their other obligations, their other relationships, their other lives. Caleb graduates in May, and the ceremony takes place on a warm evening when the air is thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the promise of summer. I sit in the faculty section, watching as my students cross the stage to receive their diplomas, feeling the particular mixture of pride and melancholy that comes with watching young people prepare to leave you behind. When Caleb's name is called, I find myself searching the crowd for Rowan's face, watching him beam with the uncomplicated joy of a father whose son has accomplished something meaningful. The Hales host a small celebration in their backyard afterward, just family and a few close friends. Naomi has strung lights between the trees, creating pools of warm illumination across the lawn. There's a table laden with home-cooked food, a cooler filled with beer and soft drinks, the comfortable chaos of people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. I almost don't go, using the excuse of other obligations to avoid what feels like an intrusion into a life that isn't really mine to share. But Caleb specifically asked me to attend, mentioning the invitation 3 separate times during his final week of classes, and I realized that declining would require explanations I'm not prepared to give. So I find myself standing in their backyard, making conversation with neighbors I recognize but don't really know, watching Rowan laugh with his family in the golden light of early evening. There's something both painful and beautiful about seeing him in this context, surrounded by the life he's built with careful intention and genuine love. He moves between his guests with easy grace, making sure everyone has what they need, celebrating his son's achievement with the kind of presence that makes the moment feel significant rather than routine. This is who he is when he's not sitting in my living room wrestling with doubts and unspoken longings. A man at peace with his choices, content in his role as husband and father and pillar of his small community. I stay long enough to be polite, to congratulate Caleb properly and share a few words with his parents about his bright future, then slip away as the evening settles into the comfortable rhythm of people who have nowhere else they need to be. No one seems to notice my departure, which feels both disappointing and exactly right. At home, I pour myself a glass of wine and sit on my back porch, listening to the sounds of my neighborhood settling into night. Somewhere in the distance, I can hear the faint echo of music from the Hales celebration, carried on the warm breeze that rustles through the trees in my small garden. The sound is too distant to identify, but it reminds me of all the life happening just beyond the boundaries of my carefully constructed solitude. Later, much later, I'm reading in my study when I decide to look for a particular poem I want to include in next fall's curriculum. I pull down a volume of contemporary verse from the shelf, searching for the piece about memory and loss that has been nagging at the edges of my consciousness all evening. As I flip through the pages, a small piece of paper falls out, landing on the floor beside my chair. I pick it up and unfold it, recognizing Rowan's handwriting immediately. The message is brief, written in the careful block letters he uses for important things. Thank you for keeping it that way. I sit with the note for a long time, trying to remember when he might have placed it there, what moment of trust or vulnerability prompted him to leave this small acknowledgement of what I've given him. The paper is worn at the edges, suggesting it's been folded and unfolded several times before he decided to leave it for me to find. I read it again, then fold it carefully and slide it back into the book, placing the volume exactly where it was before. Outside, the sounds of celebration have faded, replaced by the quiet symphony of crickets and settling houses. The evening light has given way to true darkness, and in the warm stillness of my study, I feel both the ache of what could never be and the strange solace of being the one who knew him best, even if no one else ever would. This is enough, I tell myself. This secret gratitude, this hidden understanding, this love that asks for nothing and gives everything. It has to be enough.